Father Roberto C. Yap, S.J., President of the Ateneo de Manila University. Father Joaquin Jose Marie C. Sumpaico, S.J., Vice President for Basic Education. Mrs. Maria Victoria Panlilio Di Malanta, Principal of the Senior High School. Administrators, faculty members, professionals, and staff. Fellow parents, alumni, and friends of the Ateneo. My dear graduating class of 2021. First of all, congratulations from the bottom of my heart. I share your deep joy, pride, and gratitude for this significant achievement and milestone in your lives today, your graduation from senior high school. Part of me is still amazed and even quite unbelieving that you have completed your years in basic education and are moving on to college. Kay bilis naman talaga ng panahon. I think my fellow parents can identify with me when I say I can still imagine your first day of school in prep or kinder, the many 7th birthday parties we attended, your first Holy Communion and confirmation, the yearly fiestas and salos-salos, whether in grade school or high school, the basketball, football, volleyball, track, or swimming events or lessons, the stage plays and musical performances, field trips, class nights and retreats, your graduations from grade school and junior high school, and yes, your grade 11 junior prom, which was shortly before the pandemic and quarantine. And now here you are, suddenly on the verge of adulthood at 18 or 17 years of age, already qualified to vote next year. And I hope you don't forget to register if you haven't yet. Many of you have already made an initial choice of college major program and university to enroll in, and maybe are even beginning to think of future careers. I know this year has been challenging and stressful because you've had to make decisions for yourselves that will have a bearing on your future. Growing towards independence and maturity means you have to take on more responsibilities, both at school and at home. And this year, those two worlds have merged. It's exciting to dream and imagine tomorrow full of possibilities, but it also demands careful planning, time management, and defining priorities. And it has been a year like no other. Every year we speak of a graduating class or batch or cohort, but we often also speak of generations, so that you are not just a batch of graduates, but also part of a generation. The more common and popular notion of the term associates it with age chronology, so that we usually talk of baby boomers, Gen Xers, Gen Yers, millennials, and Gen Zers, reducing generational identities and characteristics to a fixed range of years. There is, however, a less familiar usage of the term that is richer and more meaningful for our present context. In sociology, a generation is defined by a shared experience of a traumatic event that produces a collective consciousness with potential for collective action, allowing its members to play a part in social change. You are the first batch of Ateneo Senior High School graduates who went through a whole school year amidst the anxieties, uncertainties, and sufferings resulting from the COVID-19 pandemic and the consequent community quarantine. It required you to spend grade 12 fully online, physically distant from your classmates and friends, and locked out of our beautiful Ateneo campus. It called for many adjustments in your school and home life, including possibly dealing with illness and mental health issues. But you are not alone in this experience. Your senior high school teachers and administrators also went through it and did their share to build the Ateneo Blue Cloud, our online campus. They carefully prepared programs and lessons within the framework of the adaptive design for learning. They accompanied you in your intellectual, psychosocial, and spiritual formation despite the physical distance. And you were, of course, in lockdown with us, your parents and family, whether you liked it or not, with the lines between home, school, and office often blurring and these spaces flowing into one another, not always easily and smoothly. So we are all members of what we might call the COVID-19 generation, despite our age differences. And by extension, we can say this for students, families, schools, and other communities across the country and indeed the world. In that sense, we all belong to the same generation. But there are differences and disparities. The experience and consciousness of the same social trauma is also shaped by social location, position, and relations. As we continue to confront an invisible virus, we are also witnesses to an increasingly visible social illness of inequality and division within and across countries, whether in access to food and other basic necessities, or the availability of effective vaccines, life-saving healthcare, and advanced digital technology, or opportunities for secure and safe employment or other sources of income and livelihood. Across the world, there are differences not just in the wealth and resources of countries, but also in the competence, integrity, and accountability of particular governments, and whether or not they are truly committed to serving the public and promoting the common good. These disparities have been heightened by the pandemic and intensified its effects. In his book, Let Us Dream, Pope Francis warns that despite this era-defining experience of our generation, we could tragically end up in a much worse post-pandemic world if we surrender to the temptations of isolation and indifference. He says the path to a better future, the subtitle of his book, starts with the discovery and recognition of ourselves as a people with a shared dignity, with a history, an identity, and a soul. And for him, this dignity that unites us comes from our common origin, our common home, and our common destiny. Thus, we hold a promise in our hearts and a gift that we can share with others, giving hope for our world and our future. Pope Francis points out that, quote, calamities for a time throw us off balance, yet paradoxically, they can allow a people to recover its memory and therefore its capacity for action, its hope. Let it not be said in years to come that in response to the coronavirus crisis, we failed to act to restore the dignity of our peoples, to recover our memory, and to remember our roots, unquote. The year of your graduation, and thus your batch 2021, is unique not only because it marks 1 year of the COVID-19 pandemic. It's a particular blessing that we also have special commemorations that can allow us to reflect more deeply on our experiences, bring us together as a community, and help us to act collectively with a shared purpose, vision, and hope for a better future. In the sociology of generations, commemorations are important because they create a sense of a public past. Commemorations sustain social memory. As Pope Francis emphasizes, remembering awakens us to our history and identity, leads us to recover our roots and discover our heritage. It is also an invitation to freely and gratefully share our gifts as individuals and as a community to a divided and wounded world in need of reconciliation and healing. There are 5 anniversaries that we mark this year that may help us recognize our gifts as a people. This awareness can start with our small community at the Ateneo de Manila. But we are also called to share that discovery and uphold that same dignity among a much wider community. For Pope Francis, this is the starting point for renewing the world. We began celebrating last May 20th, the start of the Ignatian year, commemorating 500 years since the Battle of Pamplona, a key moment in the conversion of St. Ignatius. As proud Ateneo Senior High School graduates on the cusp of your college years, you can probably identify with the figure of Inigo, who was anything but saintly and spiritual in the beginning. He was instead vain and ambitious, full of dreams of worldly exploits, riches, and honors as a knight of the Spanish king. But the Lord had other plans. The cannonball that shatters his leg becomes the means for Inigo to encounter God. The Lord lovingly draws on his strengths and redirects his old passions toward following and serving him, Christ the King. This same God acting in our lives and the world today personally meets us where we are. Mind you, even while you are online playing League of Legends, Valorant, or NBA 2K21. He is in our hearts. He gives us his spirit to help us recognize and face the cannonball moments in our lives. Even as we might get decentered from our narrow plans for ourselves, he recenters us, turning our gaze to see all things new in him. He helps us to discover the mission to which he calls us despite our weaknesses. He patiently forms us to grow in inner freedom to make life-giving choices. At this moment of transition in your lives, the story of St. Ignatius is a reminder that growing up means not just finding your field of interest and eventual profession, but more importantly, discerning your true passion and purpose according to his loving plan. Indeed, it means discovering your vocation, to follow the Lord beyond your immediate family and friends into a world with many needs that you can respond to with your unique gifts. Despite our poverty and underdevelopment as a country, we Filipinos also have gifts to give to one another and to a world trying to rise from the devastation of the pandemic and the socio-political ills it has exposed. One of these jewels of the pauper is our faith. As the great Jesuit historian and humanist Father Horacio de la Costa wrote in 1946, amidst the death and destruction of the Second World War. He says, our faith and our music, quote, are the bonds that bind us together, the soul that makes us one. This nation may be conquered, trampled upon, enslaved, but it cannot perish. Like the sun that dies every evening, it will rise again from the dead, unquote. This year, we also commemorate the 500th anniversary of Christianity in the Philippines. But it is a complex history because the cross of Christ arrived with the sword of the Spanish conquistadores. Catholicism was intertwined with colonialism, even though they are distinct. We have continued to embrace the faith as our own, even as we have repudiated the invaders who initially brought it to our shores. Ironically, it is now Filipino migrants who are populating churches in the old colonizer and missionary countries of Europe and bringing the faith to their homes. But there are continuing tensions. In his later work, Father de la Costa himself reflected on the hybridity or the split nature of Filipino culture, with many disjoints between formal institutions and long-held informal practices and norms. According to Father de la Costa, quote, for our people, the faith dominated with its ritual and theocratic forms, but it did not help to reinterpret or recast our social norms. Like government, it became a superimposition on the community. Community life called for processions, church weddings, and burials, but the deeper convictions of conscience were not touched. There is a sentimental value to thinking that we are all Christians, but since Christianity fails to penetrate our motivational mainsprings, Christianity fails to unite us in our life, unquote. This is a powerful critique of Christianity and the Catholic Church in the Philippines from the first Filipino provincial superior of the Philippine Jesuits. It is a direct challenge to us here at the Ateneo de Manila, including you, young Atenean graduates of the senior high school. How well do we know and appreciate our faith? Is it something we just take for granted, handed down by our families, schools, and parishes, a cultural byproduct of centuries of colonialism? Or is it a matter of conscientious choice, which we can explain and defend, and which informs our decisions and actions? There is a moment in our history as a people when our faith became the wellspring and driving force of socio-political change, when we could proudly claim it was our gift to the world. Handog ng Pilipino sa mundo, mapayapang paraang pagbabago. This year, we also commemorate the 35th anniversary of the EDSA revolution. Let me share a little of that story because, like a number of your parents and teachers, I'm part of that generation who became witnesses to our nation's singular triumph over authoritarianism. On the surface, EDSA was a spontaneous 4-day mobilization of individuals and groups, coming as a direct response to a personal appeal from Jaime Cardinal Sin. But it was also the result of a longer process of painstaking education, organization, and mobilization that started at least since the late 1960s and 1970s, but especially after the assassination of Ninoy Aquino in 1983. It eventually led to active participation in the 1986 snap presidential election in support of Cory Aquino. These formative experiences in active nonviolence as a strategy, principle, and even spirituality led to the internalization among key EDSA participants of what Father Jose Blanco, SJ, called alay dangal, an offering of dignity. It was a new political translation of bayanihan inspired by Ninoy Aquino's heroic self-sacrifice. The French Jesuit political scientist, Father Pierre de Charentonnet, has observed that the participation of Christians at EDSA may seem mundane, and yet it was politically effective. People appealed personally to the soldiers and prayed in front of them. Masses were said at the barricades. People sang the Amanamin and Pananagutan. Nuns stood before tanks and led the recitation of the Rosary while people held up statues of the Virgin Mary and the crucifix. Quote, these events touched a cultural and religious background common to all belligerents. It matched the culture of a people whose religion was part of it. Nowhere is civil society that close to spirituality and Catholicism, unquote. For those who saw the struggle against dictatorship as part of bearing witness to Christ, it was a deeply personal commitment, a matter of conviction. Father de la Costa died in 1977, but he would have been pleased with what happened in 1986. In a distinctly Filipino manner and style, the Catholic faith had become part of national life and indeed a source of unity. A key catalyst for the EDSA uprising was the historic post-election statement of the Catholic Bishops' Conference of the Philippines, which declared the Marcos government as having no moral basis because it had deliberately subverted the people's will in the electoral process. For the bishops, what was called for was a nonviolent struggle for justice. But the statement was not just a moral and political judgment. It also showed a sincere desire and effort to listen to and to be one with the people. The CBCP said, quote, in a creative, imaginative way, under the guidance of Christ's Spirit, let us pray together, reason together, decide together, act together, always to the end that the truth prevail, that the will of the people be fully respected, unquote. The church was becoming a community rather than just an institution. As Father de la Costa had hoped, the church at EDSA was no longer sila, but tayo. But the faith in God and the church as a community also translated crucially into a faith in ourselves as a people capable of socio-political transformation. Father de la Costa reminds us, however, that history is only prologue. Even as EDSA is a genuine popular achievement, we are also aware of the many limitations of its vision and outcome, especially the persistence of weak and unresponsive political and socio-economic institutions dominated by a few elite families. Continuing poverty, inequality, and insecurity have fueled a deep resentment among the Filipino people against politics as usual and traditional politicians. This has led to a renewed attraction to authoritarian figures who present themselves as outsiders, but who in fact are also political elites. They exploit the very urgent and valid demands for social justice and political inclusion in order to advance a very narrow, personalistic, and self-serving agenda. Thus today, more than ever, as we struggle to rebuild our country and our world amidst the suffering around us, and as you young adult citizens begin to make political decisions, what is crucial, as Father de la Costa has also emphasized, is not only how we understand our history, but also how we act because of it. Let me end by pointing to two more commemorations that we mark this year. They can help us recognize our identity and dignity as a people and also inspire us to dream, directing us to a path for a better future, as Pope Francis has said. They are the anniversaries of people who coincidentally share the same name, Jose Rizal and St. Joseph, San Jose. Today, the day of your graduation from the Ateneo Senior High School and the commencement of the next phase of your formation, is the 160th birth anniversary of the foremost alumnus of the Ateneo de Manila and the national hero of the Philippines. This year also marks the 125th anniversary of Rizal's execution by the Spanish colonial government in 1896, which inspired and galvanized our people in the struggle for sovereignty and democracy, which in many respects continues today. Pope Francis has also declared December 8th, 2020 to 2021 as the year of St. Joseph, the husband of Mary, our Blessed Mother, and adoptive father of Jesus, celebrating the 150th anniversary of the proclamation of St. Joseph as patron of the Universal Church. Both of these commemorations provide a basis for unity and a call to action as a Filipino nation and as God's people. Marahil naalala pa ninyo mula sa mga klase sa Filipino sa junior high school na sa katapusan ng El Filibusterismo nagsalita si Jose Rizal sa pamamagitan ni Padre Florentino sa gitna ng kabiguan at tila kawalang pag-asa. Hayaan ninyong bigkasin ko ngayon bilang isang ama at guro, bilang isang nakatatandang Pilipino, ang hamon at pangarap ni Rizal para sa inyo. Nasaan ang kabataan na maglalaan ng kanilang mga ginintuang sandali, ng kanilang mga pangarap at ng kanilang kasigabuhan na ikabubuti ng tinubuan? Nasaan ang kabataan na magbububo ng kanilang dugo upang mahugasan ang gayong karaming krimen, ang gayong karaming kahihiyan, ang gayong karaming kamuhi-muhing mga bagay? Dalisay at walang bahid dungis ang buhay na kailangan maging handog upang ang alay ay maging karapat-dapat. Nasaan kayo, kabataan, na magtataglay ng sigla ng buhay na tumakas na sa aming mga ugat, ng karinisan ng pagkukurong na dungisan na sa aming diwa, at ng lagablab at sigabong nanlamig na sa aming mga puso? Hinihintay namin kayo, o kabataan. Hinihintay namin kayo. Paano kayo tutugon sa hamon na ito? Sabi ni Pope Francis, mangarap tayo. Hindi ba yun ang ginawa ni San Jose? Ang mangarap. Ngunit ang napaniginipan niya ay ang mismong pangarap ng Diyos. Ang kalooban ng Diyos para sa kanyang anak at sa sangkatauhan. At paano tumugon si San Jose? Hindi ba natin siya narinig na magsalita sa Ebanghelyo? Ngunit kumilos siya. Nagtaya siya sa gitna ng mga malakanan, bol at COVID na pangyayari sa buhay niya na tila nagwasak sa mga naunang plano at kagustuhan niya. Naging daan ang kanyang mga pangarap at malayang paghahandog ng sarili, ang kanyang bukasyon bilang asawa at ama, para maisakatuparan ang mismong paghahandog ng Diyos, ang pakikiisa ng Diyos sa sangkatauhan sa pamamagitan ni Kristo na kanyang inampon at pinalaki na siyang kaligtasan nating lahat. Modelo rin si San Jose sa uri ng pagkilos na nagpapalaya, na hindi maingay at nakatuon sa sarili, kundi mapagkumbabang nabubuhay sa liblib ng mga puok at niyayakap ang nasa laylayan dahil naroroon ang Panginoon. Sinabi ng anghel sa kanya, "Huwag kang mangamba." Lubos siyang nagtiwala sa katapatan ng Diyos. Hindi tayo pababayaan dahil nasa atin ang Diyos. At matatagpuan natin siya kung taimtim natin siyang hahanapin at pakikinggan sa ating buhay. Sa ganitong diwa, nais kong ibahagi sa inyo ang titik ng isang awitin mula kay Father Eduardo Ontiveros, SJ, na natutunan ko nung ako'y nasa kolehiyo. Bilang mga Atenista, saan mang pamantasan kayo magpunta, ito rin ay isang paalala, pamana, at panalangin. Jesus na aking kapatid, sa lupa nami bumalik, iyong mukhay ibang-iba, hindi kita nakikilala. Tulutan mo aking mata, mamulat sa katotohanan. Ikaw poon makikilala sa taong mapagkumbaba. Muling binabati ko kayo sa inyong pagkatapos at nagpapasalamat ng lubos sa paghubog sa inyo ng Ateneo de Manila, lalo na ng senior high school.